It's the Almost Perfect Podcast. Welcome to the Almost Perfect Podcast, a celebration of fuck-ups, failures, and falling flat on your face. This is a podcast that believes you can learn from experience, but that experience doesn't have to be your own. Hi, I'm Bob Perfect, and I'm a functional fuck-up. Let's learn from somebody else's mistakes. And today we are learning from Mbali Ntuli. Now, Mbali is a politician, and she is a politician who is currently challenging for the leadership of the DA. Now, I know what a lot of you are thinking. Bob, I watch your stand-up comedy. I have seen your tweets. I have seen what you say on Facebook. Don't you hate the DA? And yeah, yeah, I do. I am not a fan of the DA in the slightest. But I like Mbali. We followed each other on the internet for a few years now, and Mbali's actually come to a few of my shows, I think both musically, the gigs I've organized for music stuff, and she's come to comedy gigs, and obviously that's appreciated, but not necessarily why I interviewed her. It's more just because we seem to be quite similar in a lot of ways, and quite different in a lot of other ways, but we share a lot of common interests. We both love sci-fi, we both want to help people and make the world a better place. And yeah, I've had Mbali on this list that I've got. So I've got like a list of about 200 odd people at the moment. I'm constantly adding people to it. But Mbali's been on the list for quite a long time. And when she challenged John to a debate, I was like, let me try and get an interview whilst I still can. And I'm so grateful that she agreed to it. We had an entire hour-long chat, and we discuss everything. We discuss politics, we discuss sci-fi, we discuss, just life. What it's like growing up in South Africa, growing up in the new South Africa, growing up in suburban and rural households. And yeah, we get a good idea of who Mbali is, and I think you'll like her, and I like her. And I'll put it this way. There's not a fucking chance in hell I will ever vote for the DA if John Steenhuisen or any of his cronies are in power. Straight up. Fuck them. Fuck those assholes. John's actually got me blocked on Twitter, and what a weak-ass motherfucker. So, yeah, I definitely wouldn't. But if Mbali wins, I mean, it's now an option. Like, the DA was never an option for me, but if Mbali wins the leadership, it's now an option, and we'll have to see how things go. But that's just my personal opinions, and I don't think this podcast is going to have like a major effect on politics or the votes or anything like that. I don't think it'll even maybe shift your mindsets, but it'll give you an understanding of Mbali, and maybe you want to be a politician, maybe you want to enact change, maybe this is a career path that you've thought about, and I know I did growing up, and I looked at it and was like, no thank you, that looks like hell, that looks like the worst way to get stuff done. But Mbali seems to get a lot of stuff done as a politician with her position. And even when people are trying to punish her, even when people are trying to take her a peg down, she manages to still do good with it. So yeah, you'll get to find out what we chat about just now. Let me tell you about my week. My week was good. I've had a very good week. The reason why this is coming to you a little bit late today is because I was actually moderating a panel discussion for the Durban Film Mart before this, and I'm going to be moderating quite a few more over the course of the weekend, so I'm really looking forward to that. I had a great chat this morning. We discussed performance writing, which is something, weirdly enough, that I got into in the last year. I mean, I've been a performance writer in terms of stand-up comedy the entire time, but I've been script writing for the last year or so, and I got to learn a lot more about it today, so that was really, really cool. And I got to see my gran, which was something that I truly, I cherished, because, yeah, if you listen to the podcast, things aren't great with my family and stuff at the moment. My grandfather has cancer and is in the final stages, and so, Corona coming at the same time has made life very difficult. I haven't been able to visit them, I haven't been able to help them, and that's something I've wanted to do the entire time. So I'm grateful that I got to see my gran this week. We went and we had breakfast, and it was just one of those things where it's just so nice to actually get to see someone again and to talk and to just live life a little bit, even though we've still got to be super cautious, and especially with my gran, obviously, you got to be as cautious as possible when it comes to this coronavirus. But yeah, I just wanted to let you know, I've had a pretty good week in terms of that. That's been pretty great. My gran also bought me some books because we went to the KZNSA and they have representatives from the Dennis Hurley Center selling books there. So you'll see this all around Durban. The Dennis Hurley Center has their basically people who at the Dennis Hurley Center, and they sell books to make a living. And so you can get secondhand books. You can get amazing, amazing books. It's cool thing is I've got a cool relationship with the guy who sells at the KZNSA, and he knows my taste. He knows what I like. Like I told him I like Zakesam Da, and so he kept aside 2 Zakesam Da books for me the last time I went there. Got a wonderful Bill Hicks book as well. And I bring all of this up because I've got so many books now. My bookshelf can't fit them all. My side tables, like there's just books everywhere in my flat now because I've spent the last year or two just buying tons and tons and tons of secondhand books, and I've been reading them, and now I want to give them away. Well, I'm going to give them away. I'm going to be giving away 1 book a month to a patron over on patreon.com/almostperfect. That's right, this podcast is brought to you by you, the listener. You can go to patreon.com/almostperfect, where there are multiple tiers to support this podcast and to get various benefits from Almost Perfect Media. You can get exclusive content occasionally. You can get early access to content occasionally. You can get to suggest guests whenever you like, and you can also ask guest questions. I do let people know over there on Patreon when guests are coming on, and you'll hear in this podcast we actually had some listener questions. So go to patreon.com/almostperfect, and at any level, as long as you have a South African address I can send the book to, I will be sending out 1 book a month to a random patron. I'm not actually going to put it on Patreon because you're not allowed to do like gambling things on there, and a raffle is a gambling thing apparently. So yeah, this month the book that I'm giving away is I Married a Communist by Philip Roth. I read it last year. It was hectic. It devastated me in a lot of ways, but it was also just fantastically written, well-paced, great story. Just a great book, and I'm going to send it to one of you who's on patreon.com/almost perfect. What else do I need to tell you about? Oh man, I can't wait for the Dune movie. Yo, I'm so pumped. I'm so pumped for the trailer. Like, I just want to see it ASAP. So I'm super, super pumped for the Dune movie. And I bring that up because we discussed Dune a little bit in this conversation. We discuss Isaac Asimov, we get into Star Wars, we get into quite a few different things. We chat about Philip K. Dick. So this is a really, really fun conversation. It's also a serious conversation in some aspects, and it's one that I'm pretty stoked with. I'm pretty happy with. It's not like if you were expecting me to challenge and whatever, you clearly haven't been listening to this podcast, because that's not what we do here. This is about getting people's stories, this is about letting people tell you who they are. And normally when a politician tells me who they are, I don't believe them, but I believe in Bali, and maybe you will too. Anyway, I need to give some shout outs because one of the tiers over on patreon.com is the Titular Titles tier. Now this is a $10 tier where you get to pick your title right here on the Almost Perfect podcast. You get to be a member of the cast and crew. You are the reason why I get to say we instead of I whenever I talk about Almost Perfect podcast and Almost Perfect Media. Firstly, though, I do want to give a shout out to the 2 new patrons that we have over on patreon.com. Bonga Musa Zondi. Old Musa is a comedian here in Durban. He's also, if you want to get some ads on East Coast Radio, he's the man to chat to. So shout outs to Musa Zondi, and then also shout outs to Patrick Duff, who's also a new patron and an ex-guest. That's the second guest who has signed up to the Patreon account here on Almost Perfect. So thank you. Out of about 70 guests, that's 2 people. That's like, 1 in 35. So once it gets to 105, we'll have 3 patrons from guests. Cool, this is going to work out really well in the long term. I just need like 700. I'll have 20 patrons if I get 700 guests. Cool, that sounds good to me. Anyways, shout outs to the Titular Titles tier. We have got the Chief Sales Officer of Subtle Heresies in the Greater Overberg region, Rousseau. Shout outs to Rousseau. We've got Karan Slamman, who is the Almost Perfect Youth Group Leader. We've also got King Julian. We've got Vishendra Naidu, who is my spiritual advisor. And lastly, we're gonna do the old school one. It's His Excellency President for Life, Field Marshal Stephen Olivier, VC, DSO, MC, Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the seas, and conqueror of the British Empire and Africa in general, and certain parts of KwaZulu-Natal in particular, or something slightly less pretentious, like executive producer. So that is the cast and crew right here on the Almost Perfect podcast. Thank you very much to each and every single one of you. It's so appreciated. And it's needed. Like, I'm trying to turn this thing into a business. I'm trying to turn Almost Perfect Media, trying to turn the websites into a more regular content stream. I want to write more for it. So the more people who sign up to Patreon, the more time I can spend on, writing top fives, writing about local music, international music, tons of things that I want to give coverage to. But you know how life goes, man. It's what you get paid for is what you'll end up doing. So the more patrons we've got, the more I can do Almost Perfect things. So if that sounds like a good vibe to you, patreon.com/almost perfect. And lastly, another way you can support this podcast is by buying a mug. Yes, we have got Almost Perfect mugs. You can check what they look like over on social media. I've given away 3 from last month for 2 people who went and left a review on iTunes, and I'm doing that again this month. So I'm only giving away 1 mug this month, but if you go to iTunes or Apple Podcasts and leave a review there and send me that review to bob@almostperfect.co.za, I will enter you into a draw. We'll do this every single month. So no matter when you're listening to this podcast, even if it's in 2022 and it's January or whatever, and you're going back into the thing, you can probably leave a review. Email it to bob@almostperfect.co.za, and yeah, you will be entered into a draw for a mug. I don't have the names of the people who won in front of me, which is poor planning on my behalf, but they know who they are, and they'll be getting their mugs soon. But you can also buy a mug. They are 100 Rand, they're 100 Rand each, and if I have to mail it to you, it's also an extra 100 Rand on top of that. But the important thing to know there is 10 Rand from each mug sale goes to Sisonke. Now, Sisonke is an organization by sex workers for sex workers that are working to decriminalize sex work in South Africa, but also provide support systems for sex workers who have obviously been disproportionately affected by COVID. And it's an organization that I value very highly. And so I want us, as Almost Perfect Media and as a collective, to support them. So 10 Rand from each mug that you buy from me will go to Sisonke. So far, we've given them about $400. And yeah, I'm looking forward to just that number going up and up and up and up over the years. So you can go check them out, sisonke.org.za yourself, or you can just buy a mug from me, bob@almostperfect.co.za. And I'm pretty certain that's everything I need to tell you. If it isn't, well, so what? This is how it is. This is where we're at, and we're about to get into the Almost Perfect podcast with Mbali Ntuli. So how are you living in Bali?
I'm living good. It's been a very interesting year, full of ups and downs. Professionally, my life is in a very interesting place. But personally, I'm really having a great time. I'm loving being a mom. I've just bought a new house, so I'm really excited to start decorating and renovating that. And I'm trying to get better at trying to have a work-life balance and find some sort of way to center myself. The only thing I'm not doing really well is taking care of my body, but since I had COVID, I'm far more aware that I need to start doing a lot better at that. But otherwise, I really can't complain.
You had COVID?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay, I've been off the social media streets as like a personal development thing, so I did not see that. That's crazy.
Yeah, I had COVID. I had it really bad. I had to go to hospital, and, it's unlike anything I've ever experienced. And I'm not the kind of person that gets sick a lot, so I don't often get the cold or a flu. So when I started getting sick, I thought, oof, I hope it's not COVID. But I mean, it is kind of, winter season, so perhaps it's that. So I hope that it was just maybe my turn to get the flu or to get a cold. But by the 3rd day of being sick, it was so bad that my partner had to come and take me to hospital. And it just really felt like I had an elephant on my chest. It felt like I couldn't breathe. My daughter, who was 17 months at the time, is tiny. I mean, she's like 11 kgs or something. And I could barely pick her up. I was so tired. I was so fatigued. I couldn't get up to do anything. And so I went to the hospital. And unfortunately, it was before the alcohol ban had happened. And I mean, that's got its own politics. But what I did really realize was that the waiting period, because there were so many trauma incidents, was really long. And so even though I had COVID and I was the only person in the COVID line, they obviously had to let everyone else who was basically near death go in before. And so I ended up waiting in the cold parking lot of the hospital for about 6 hours until I got treated and looked at and, had the doctor tell me what to do. Then they took my swabs and everything and sent me back home with some medication. And then 2 days later, they said I had COVID. But by then, I definitely knew I had COVID because I was just so ill. Luckily, I was able to get a lot of, the vitamins and the zinc and all the things that people were recommending that you take at the time. And then I got better and I actually finished my quarantine period and I thought everything was great. And, the first few times that I went out, I just went out to the grocery store. And sort of on the fourth day after I was past my quarantine, I started resuming my campaign for leader of the DA. The very next day I collapsed and I had to be taken to hospital and hospitalized for COVID. I had really bad chest pains and it turned out that the COVID had created something called pericarditis, which is basically the inflammation of the tissue around my heart. And I still have it. And the doctor says it's still going to take a couple of months for it to fully go away. So I'm not allowed to do any kind of rigorous exercise or to exert myself too much because I still have inflamed tissue around my heart. And I suppose it's different for everyone because my partner, who was with me for 5 seconds to take me to the hospital, got sick the very next day. And he's still quite sick now, which has been about 2 months.
That's the thing. I've heard the long-term effects of COVID are varied and just, I'm honestly terrified of it. And I've been trying to be as cautious as humanly possible. And I keep telling people, like, just because we're in level 2 now, like, doesn't mean you can just go crazy and just go wild and just, forget that this thing exists because it affects young people, it affects old people, it affects everyone. I mean, in the South African art scene, we had someone, promoted die and he was 33 years old. And that's the thing that's terrifying me. And it's just like, I just wish people would take it a little bit more seriously because until we get a vaccine, we are for the long haul, unfortunately. Well, that's the way I feel, at least.
Definitely. And I've had about 10 people that I know personally die from COVID, including a colleague of mine who was, the chairperson of my committee. And, one day we had the meeting and I was sort of like, oh, what's going on? You don't look great or whatever. And then we had another meeting where he wasn't there. And the next thing we heard, he had passed away. So, and also relatively young person. So it's just been crazy. And then I've heard people who are like 86 have recovered and people that are 25 have died. My doctor also told me that he has 2 patients in their 20s who came in with COVID and as a result of COVID now have, full type 2 diabetes because they can't figure out how COVID just seems to attack everything at once. I mean, I had no heart condition at all before COVID, nothing. And now I have this pericarditis. And other people who had no issues, who didn't smoke, now have severe lung issues. So it is a very scary disease. And I keep thinking, I can't believe this is because, people decided that bats were a delicacy, I guess.
I mean, there's so many different ideas about how it came about, but
I'm just teasing.
I know, but at the same time, it is. I mean, for me, it's like I was already looking at like meat as a just industry and the negatives behind it, and I think for me, COVID's definitely one of the things that highlights, because people talk about wet market, but a wet market's like just a market. Like that's what markets are. Most markets are wet markets if they sell produce and animal goods and stuff like that. We have them here as well in Durban, in South Africa, all around the world. They're a normal thing. I mean, it's just literally a normal thing, but obviously terminology used and the way like the media spins things, people freak out a little bit. But it is because of meat. If you look at chickens, if you look at cows, if you look at how we do things, yeah, there's going to be diseases and there's going to be more. So for me, it was like another wake up call because I was already on that wave of, I mean, I've got no moral issues with eating meat typically. Like, I don't think it's a problem to, kill an animal for your sustenance. It's just the way we're doing it has clearly got issues. So,
I completely agree.
Do you want to elaborate?
I mean, it's one of the things that, and I mean, I'm not getting too political here, but it's one of the things in my manifesto where I've said that we need to actually really look at the regulations around that. Not only are animals sentient beings, and even though we have to sometimes kill them for sustenance, but there's far more humane ways in which you can do that our ancestors have been doing for hundreds of years. And what we've done is basically screwed up the natural order of things by putting them in cages and just the mass commercialization of it. And it's an indictment on us, and no wonder we're getting sick from the way that we do it. But you know what? The people that get most affected are people who are already poor and vulnerable because they can't afford to have these fancy organic free-range chickens. They have to eat the stuff that's pumped full of steroids and all kinds of things because that's the choice that we live in. And that's just the way that our world has become. We're just unethical in the way that we create economic systems.
Yeah, it's oh man. Well, yeah, you're getting into stuff that I think about quite a lot, and I can imagine within your party where like you're a bit more on the, I don't think you're socialist necessarily, but you are more on the Marxist side of thinking, right?
Well, I sort of think of myself as a social centrist, if there is such a thing, but I'm also not the kind of person who's really married to ideology because I just don't think that at the end of the day it really comes into the bread and butter issues, particularly in a place like South Africa. I mean, the fathers of liberalism, for example, John Stuart Mill and others, basically thought about the disenfranchisement of black people and were kind of supporting slavery in their ways. And a lot of liberalism was for Western liberalism, so it didn't take into account everything. And while some of the ideas are noble around, individual rights, and I think we can all agree that we want people to love who they want, fuck who they want, and have little as possible government intervention in that, it just doesn't work in the context of many places in Africa and in South Africa in particular. And I think you have to have a far more pragmatic approach to how you resolve issues. And some of those, quite frankly, are ones that are going to have to be unique to the South African system. So I believe in a social safety net for vulnerable people. I don't think any society is worth itself if it has children that are still dying in pit toilets.
Yeah.
I don't think that, you can say that you want no market regulation when we see what happens when we go to the extreme ends of over-capitalism or systems that are over-indebted into capitalism. And so I just want to live in a world where everybody has a fair chance of making it. And if they can't make it for whatever reasons, whether it's genetic, whether they are predisposed to maybe being addicts or whatever, that we take a kind approach at making sure that those people are not left to fend for themselves in an already really tough world. And I just think if we could put those social safety nets in place, we could do so much more in this country. And we'd actually be bridging the gap between making us the most unequal country in the world into one that had, I guess, a caring and ethical economy at its center. And I think it's not difficult at all. And I think we see how much money there is that could be doing these things. We just don't have people with the political will to do it. And we don't have people that are trustworthy enough to make people believe that it's actually possible, that we could just all make sure that if everyone was taken care of for their basic needs, then everyone has a chance of actually trying to not worry about what they're going to eat, and they can start worrying about maybe what they can create or what they can contribute to society.
Yeah, I agree with you there. One of the interesting things you brought up was people believing that it can be done. Do you think there's a lack of hope in South Africa at the moment?
I think we are a deeply traumatized nation. I think obviously everyone knows about the whole legacy of apartheid and what that's done to the psyche of, people of color in particular. But I think people also don't talk about what it's done to people who may have been perpetrators, whether willingly or not. And I say or not because there's a whole generation of men in their 40s and 50s who were conscripted into doing all kinds of shit under the guise of the army and government and patriotism, who I think look around at South Africa now and think, what the fuck? And I can't imagine the kind of traumas people must have who were maybe forced to be shooting at people in townships, even though they really had no skin in the game and they didn't care, but the government made them do it. And I don't think we talk enough about what it did to white people in particular too, and how incredibly traumatized they must be. And I think because of the way our society is brought up, it probably isn't spoken about because there's an element of shame there. But I think if we're not going to try and heal holistically, we're going to continue with this trauma. And so I think we have moments of feeling hopeful in this country and moments of feeling like things could get better. But it's just, we're too inundated with the bad news of everything that's happening. We're too inundated with being scared all the time about crime and robberies and hijackings that it's very hard for hope to filter through. And at this point, I really think the only way we're going to solve it is if you have somebody who has the right kind of mindset about what needs to be done, but then it's going to be an absolutely ruthless badass at getting it done. Because we also can't have this thing of, trying to take everyone with us for unity's sakes about political parties. That's what's killing our country.
What do you mean by that?
So there's this whole crazy notion in political parties that you have to put the party first and that, you try and seem like a unified force. And I think it's bullshit because one, by their very nature, there are organizations that are going to have disagreements. But secondly, if you aren't putting the cause in South Africa first, then all you're doing is just making sure that your party is at the center of whatever needs to happen. And I don't think that any one party in this country can claim to know what should be happening all the time. And so instead of reaching out to ordinary South Africans, of which there are hundreds of thousands, who have better ideas than people that are in political parties, people keep it to themselves and try to sort of rule by decree in that sense. And for me, I don't understand it. I'm so comfortable saying, could somebody like a Professor Mary Scholes come and talk about the ecological and climate crisis that we have in South Africa, and how do we take that to ordinary South Africans and show them what it actually means for them and what they can do? Or how do we try and solve the great economic issues of our lives? Do you really think that we have politicians in this country that should be making those kinds of decisions on their own? Having met politicians and sat amongst many of them, I can tell you definitely not.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why you're probably the only politician I'm ever going to interview. I'm not a big fan of politicians in general, just because I find that they're like, so the way I see politicians is just they're actors without the skills. Like they're essentially just people who want to be famous, want to get money, want to be known, and want to have some sort of power, but don't necessarily want to do the work. And that's been my experience of politicians. I've had a lot of issues in Durban over the years as someone who's tried to make a lot of things happen. And people just don't necessarily care. They don't necessarily want to do anything unless it makes them look good. And that's been one of my biggest frustrations, is just that politics, so growing up, I wanted to get into politics. That was one of my things because I grew up listening to Rage Against the Machine and NoFX and, I loved Che Guevara and Noam Chomsky and stuff like that. And it was just it was a goal of mine was to get into politics, but I realized for myself at least, it just didn't seem like a real avenue, to actually enact change, to actually be able to do anything. It felt like there was a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of red tape, and just a lot of lies.
It's true. I mean, there definitely are people who I think really want to serve their communities. And I would say that that's the way for us to go, particularly for getting politicians at ward and local levels, because you want people that actually stay in those places, who actually care about those communities and trying to advocate for them. But I think that we are skewed in that the political party system is so incredibly powerful that even those people end up being subsumed by, I suppose, the machinery. And this is why I'm so excited about the Constitutional Court judgments, because it means that we can actually start having people organized who are independent candidates, who are going to be able to even run on special issues, for example. I mean, you could run solely on, I don't know, getting the
Arts funding.
entertainment industry, arts like on the agenda, and everyone who's interested in that could perhaps potentially vote for you. And even if they made small donations of like $100 each, you could get enough certainly to have the money to at least register with the ISC. I mean, there's still a lot to unpack about how all this is going to work out, but I really love that judgment because it means that finally we're going to have a system where we can challenge the dominant party political culture and get people who are really invested and interested in being activists for whatever areas to be there and to put those things on the agenda. And then we're going to have real competition. And I can't wait because I want to live in a country where you actually have the best of the best at the top. Because right now, for a lot of people and a lot of older people, it's almost like they can't do anything else and they've been here so long that this is all they want. And you can imagine how much those people are willing to fight not to be kicked out. And then you get gatekeeping, etc. So I'm disillusioned with the way the system is structured for sure. But it's always a catch-22. Do you leave and do something else? Or do you try and stay and change it from within? And I think also, you know, from my discussions with many people, even in the ANC, where people are sort of tearing their hair out, there's a lot of good people that are still there. And they're kind of in the same, do you leave and go try and do something else or start something else? Or do you try and fix this organization? Because it's not easy running a political party. But,
yeah, I mean, we've seen many failed attempts, you know, to lead other parties and to try and do it because there is, in South Africa at least, there's name value, you know, there's name recognition. Like, there's so much about politics that is wrestling that I love and also hate. But that's one of the things. It's just about if you go out on your own, like as an independent, you need to have all the finances, you need to have the name value, you need to have so much going for you. And even if you have all of that, it can still fail, which is what we've seen here. But I agree with you. Like, I like that, you know, the constitution's changing, that we can actually, anyone can, you know, run for president. My only concern is that we're going to see Gareth Cliff running for president next time.
Well, I very much doubt that the political parties are going to allow for a direct election of a president, although I certainly will be pushing for it. I want us to have direct elections of mayors, premiers, and presidents, because that's going to also change the nature of the coalition arrangements in our country. It's going to be very exciting, I think.
How do you think it'll change things?
Well, I think that once people can't mobilize the party around one particular candidate, as we've seen already in political parties, if that candidate is good enough to be someone who can bring different voices together in parliament, because at the moment parliament votes for the president, I think you could see someone who could be the head of state, but maybe not necessarily head of the party, but they still would have enough executive power to try and make things happen and appoint their own cabinet. So you could have the mix of all the political parties in cabinet, and hopefully, if they were smart enough, they would try to outshine each other by actually delivering the best kinds of services.
That would be ideal. I mean, that's always been my ideal idea of democracy, would be multi-party states where all the parties actually do have a say, you know, like where, because you do need the conflicting ideas. That's the whole point of democracy. It's that different ideas get spoken about, they get debated, they get agreed upon or disagreed upon, and then bills get passed. And when you have variety of people and a variety of interests being represented, that means that everyone kind of has to be on board for something to go ahead. Whereas at the moment, it's obviously just based on political will a lot of the time and based on party allegiance. And that, I don't think, does anyone favors, like, long term.
At all. And then we all just kind of sit here like lemmings, hoping that the gods above us will not screw things up too badly so that we can still kind of eat. And it's a horrible situation to feel in because, you know, you start feeling hopeless. And I mean, I'm in politics. I even have a platform. And I sometimes feel very much like, does anything I do go beyond really where I am? I mean, I can see it sometimes in KZN and in some like committee meetings if I get something passed. But the great frustration is it could be so much more, and you can't do it because of the political party, you know, sort of hammering. And so, I hope it works out because it's going to be incredible if we do it really well in South Africa. And then also if South Africans themselves get out and vote.
You're also someone who is a big proponent of just enacting things on the ground, though. So as much as there is all this red tape and, issues that you face, you do also, just do things regardless of the red tape, right?
Yeah, and I get in trouble for it quite a lot. But I mean, again, for me, at the end of the day, well, depending on why someone got into politics, I got into politics to try and really help people on the ground, because that's where I saw the most sort of vulnerable people. So there's a lot of red tape sometimes to even helping people ordinarily. But I've found ways over the years to try and subvert the system in a way that allows you to still get in and get out there. And I think it's again something that should be made so much easier for people who want to actually help to be able to do so. But I enjoy the ground war, and even as a politician, I enjoy the interactions with people on a one-on-one basis, or in communities, or
you get a lot of flack
and stuff. Sorry?
Do you get a lot of flack?
Not anymore. Sort of when I first started 14 years ago, people sort of were like, "What are you doing?" And I had a really high voice, and I guess people were just like, I sound like a child. But I think just being consistent and on the ground and doing those things have made people realize that it isn't a gimmick, and that's actually what I like and what I'm good at and what I do. And so I've built branches all over KZN. I started the branches in Nduzuma, Kwamashu, and Dinanda for the DA because they didn't have township branches there. And then after that, because I realized that, first of all, if the DA wants to be relevant, they need to be helping people that can also bring votes en masse, and that they need to be there consistently. So they have to have active branch members, and they have to be helped all the time so that they can see and finally trust that the DA might be good, or a good alternative. And then, well, I've always been in trouble a lot. But after 2014 and my fallout with Helen, I was exiled to a place called Mkanyagute, which is the second biggest district in KZN. It's the most rural in KZN, and certainly the poorest. And there was no DA person there at all. And I was told to go and start branches and be the constituency head. And I understood, obviously, that what was happening was that I was being set up to fail. And so I resigned from my youth leader position so I could concentrate on that fully. And I'm very proud of the work that we did there. Within a year, I'd gotten the first DA councillor elected there. And by the 2016 elections, which was 2 years later, I had gotten elected a councillor in every single one of the municipalities in that district. We had the second amount of activists in the whole of KZN. And because of that work, we were able to become kingmakers in 2 of the municipalities and helped to form the coalition governments that the party had in Johannesburg and the other places, because obviously we were able to leverage the fact that we were helping the IFP here so that the IFP could help us there. And that none of that would have happened if we didn't have those seats. And I'm glad that that place is still thriving. People have gotten water. Communities have been serviced in the different areas that had never seen or been able to vote for the DA before. And that's why when I've been running as leader, part of my call has been that the DA needs to understand that if it wants ordinary South Africans to look at it as something that isn't an elitist so-called white party, they actually have to go into those communities and they have to stay and they have to work there. It's not good enough just coming before the election and hoping that people will trust you. Our biggest problem as a political party is that we are not trusted by the majority of Black, Indian, and colored South Africans. And
so a lot of white people also don't trust the DA anymore.
Yeah, well, we've definitely taken a hammering there. And that's a good point, because the other thing is that the DA, I feel, in terms of its leadership currently and previously, have always assumed that they understand what white people think. And I've never thought that that was the case, because I think they don't give white people in the country enough credit for understanding how things are really. I think they still sort of think many white people need to be, coddled and, I don't know, like spared from the truth of the realities of South Africa in order not to scare them. And my argument is that these things are ubiquitous. They're all over the place. There's not a single person in South Africa who doesn't understand what's going on. And for us to pander to white people as though they're stupid and not, like everybody else, pragmatic, is actually hurting us. And of course, I mean, nobody can say that they speak for an entire race group. So I'm not sure why people have been so confident to assume that white people are with us. Certainly, many of my younger white friends do not consider the DA their party of choice. And I think that that should be a wake-up call to the party. But I suppose they're gunning on the fact that we still have historically older voters who were loyal to the DP and then the DA. But I suppose next year is going to be a referendum on all of that.
Yeah, I think next year is going to be very interesting no matter what happens with regards to the DA. But let's take it back. Where are you from and how did your political journey start? When did your awakening start?
So I'm from, on my mother's side, Mapumulo, on my father's side, Emakhabeleni, which is just outside Nkandla. Okay. I grew up in Gradville and in Duzuma and in Durban North. And in fact, my father bought our house in Durban North in 1993, but we weren't allowed to move into it. There was a bit of a backlash from the community. Wow. But by 1992, but by 1993, he was kind of like, fuck it, we're moving in. And if anyone wants to come give us problems, they must come and give us problems. And we did, and it was great. And it was just 1 year before I started school. So I started school in 94, and obviously it was the dawn of democracy, and people were excited, and it felt like everyone was talking about politics and everything that had happened. My parents were also very friendly with a lot of the ANC and IFP people who had come back from exile and sort of had nothing, and so they kind of helped to bankroll some of them just to get them started and back on their feet. And the reason that they could do that was because my father had been in taxis and had become quite a big person in the taxi industry and had started the KZN Taxi Association. My mom had been a teacher, but then resigned to become a businesswoman and had started various businesses that she ran. And so in terms of the average Black person, I suppose we were quite well off in that sense. And so when these people came back, they were able to help them. They were friendly with the king, which is really teeny. And so there was always politics around in the house. They themselves didn't belong to any one political party, but it was very alive and well, the discussions, what was happening. And my parents were very good also about explaining things. And because we lived in the suburbs, they were very careful to tell us that some people would act funny towards us without us doing anything. And that we needed to not react and not to be, sad or anything about it. It was just because some people were still a little bit backwards in the way that they thought about stuff. And so they were very euphemistic about what racism was, but they certainly spoke about the feelings that it could engender in someone and tried to protect us a lot from that. And they were both quite liberal, I suppose, in the way that they brought us up and allowed us to be a part of these discussions. So I was just very interested in politics anyway. And my second year of school, Queen Elizabeth came to KZN to come and see her Commonwealth.
I actually remember that.
Yeah, and we had to do a whole project on it, and my project won, and so I was allowed to give her flowers when she came to the Greyville Racecourse. And I was just really fascinated that a female could have, so much power, and that she could be someone who, I thought, made laws and told people how to live and be nice to each other. And that's just sort of it. That's just where I think it took hold of me. But when my father died in 96 in the suburbs, you have to, as part of our Zulu culture, have traditional ceremonies. And we had ours, obviously, in our Durban North house. And one of the cows that was being slaughtered ran out of the gate into the road. And it was quite a busy road with restaurants and everything around it. And so there were a lot of white people there who went really crazy and being like, what the hell?
96, I can imagine. I mean, I can imagine that even now, we have those politics. But I can imagine 96, that was a sight that I don't think many white people had seen.
Yeah, it was pandemonium. The whole streets sort of shut down. Anyway, a few days later, a guy called Roger Barrows, who was part of the DP, came to see my mom and just to be like, hi, welcome to the neighborhood. Also, could you please help me understand, what traditional ceremonies are about, how they happen? And he was very kind and he was very interested in the whole thing. And him and my mom formed a bit of a friendship over the years. And he used what she had told him to go and put in some bylaws around animal slaughterings and like sort of traditional ceremonies, which many of them I think still stand till today in KZN. And it was really great because what he did was he then made the community and my family sort of integrated in this one thing that they had done together, and sort of got us to all speak to each other and to understand that firstly, because it was in New South Africa, there were going to be many more families with different cultures coming in, and that we just needed to be respectful of each other. And I think my mom, as you know, a young widow at 31 with 2 kids and being scared, being surrounded by people she thought were hostile to her, really appreciated that. And so that made me also initially interested in the DP and what he did. And yeah, I think that's just where it went from time to time. And then I had a really fabulous mom who was just so many years ahead of herself. And considering the kind of schooling her and my dad had, she was so, so bright. I mean, she'd take us to the opera. She made us really interested in reading. She tried to make us travel as much as we could. And she really was all about trying to explore and have adventures and just be interested in the world around us. Obviously, throughout this whole time, we had family members that still lived in rural areas and townships. And my mom was adamant, as had been my father, that we continued to have those roots. And so even now, as I raise my daughter, I make sure she always is at our rural homesteads, that she practices parts of what our African culture is about. I'm not a religious person, but I talk to my ancestors. And so that has been a very big part of who I am in terms of, you know, the spiritual realm, I suppose. And I'm grateful for my parents who could have allowed me to just sort of be a suburban black kid who just kind of like lived a very Western-centric life, for having grounded me in that respect. And I think it's also why in politics it's been much easier, because I've walked 2 different paths. I've been definitely somebody privileged enough to go to Model C in private schools, where I've had multiracial friends and can acclimate to many different situations because of that. But at the same time, I'm not out of place in a township or in a rural area, and I've had to do all the chores and all the work that everyone who lives there would do. So nothing like that scares me. And I think it's been very liberating in a big way. And I really want that for my daughter too.
And I mean, that's stuff that like I love about, like when I've followed you online, that's one thing that I love, is that you don't shy away from traditionalism. And you even mentioned it within this podcast today, that there are actually traditional solutions to a lot of the problems that we face today, but we ignore them because of, you know, modernity essentially. But you're also quite a fan of sci-fi, right?
Love sci-fi, love fantasy. And I mean, certainly considering how screwed up the world is, like, it's such a beautiful escape. But I love the storytelling in science fiction. And because it's sometimes a little bit removed, you don't have to feel, I suppose, the weight of the guilt of whatever it is. Like for South African cinema, I can't watch another movie about AIDS or about poverty. Like I'm
usually did it best anyway.
I want to support the industry, but I can't see that kind of trauma on screen anymore, which is why I loved things like Five Fingers to Marseille. I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed In Labor as well. I was like, this is the kind of cinema in South Africa that I really want to see coming to the fore, because they're telling different stories, but they're still in the South African context, and we could do so well. But science fiction is certainly my first love. And yeah, science fiction books.
You're a big Isaac Asimov fan?
Love Isaac Asimov. I think he's been like my cover picture on Facebook since I joined Facebook, because he was such an incredible genius. I cannot imagine the kind of mind it must take to build the kinds of worlds that he did. And I think I've read probably all of his books now, and every now and then I go back and I revisit some. But just even his saga, the Foundation Saga, to me is an incredible, incredible work of art, in that this person was writing in the 60s and 70s and has imagined the kind of political nuances that would exist in these worlds, plus the kind of technological evolution, plus the concept of moral and ethical philosophical questions we'd have to ask ourselves as humanity, and they are still relevant now. And I mean, we're only starting to really crack into the kind of artificial intelligence world that he imagined, even though we've got other forms of artificial intelligence. But those questions that he was raising, even through this form of storytelling, are just as pertinent now as they were then. And it just blows my mind. And then, of course, it's just beautiful prose and just very interesting stories. So I love him very much.
He's also very hopeful.
Hey?
He's also very hopeful. Like, his stories are always full of hope. Like, that's the one thing I love about him. I mean, I also enjoy dystopian sci-fi, like, because I enjoy the reality of it. But his stories always end, with the good guys winning, essentially, which is what I enjoy about him in particular. But sci-fi in general is just one of those things that I'm with you. Like, I'm constantly reading stuff from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and it's just like, no way was this written like 60 years ago, because they're talking about today.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I like also like people like Philip K. Dick. He's got a slightly different style, but also raising really interesting, complicated questions about who we are as human beings. And I suppose at the base of sci-fi, all sci-fi writing really is the question of, who are we? What are we doing? And that's the kind of question that anyone who seeks self-awareness on this journey of life is constantly asking themselves. So it's just such a beautiful way to be reminded to keep thinking about that and to keep trying to find your center, I suppose. But yeah, I've really always just enjoyed that genre for those particular questions. There's one sci-fi book that I haven't read that everyone kills me over.
Oh, you're going to say Dune?
In fact, I said that on Twitter, and somebody actually sent me the book. They asked me for it, and they sent it to me. And so I now have to do that.
No, Dune is the one. Like, I'm a Dune head. Like, I've read that book now. I mean, I've read it twice this year. I read it, like, because I got it again last year. And it's just one of those things that, like, it's unreal. The world building that Frank Herbert is amazing. And, like, the world he builds is unreal. The politics of the world, the critiques on religion, on, making a messiah out of someone. It's all just so well done. And it speaks to, like, ecology as well. It speaks to community, giving value to your community. And it's really, I'm a big fan of Dune. Like, I love Dune. I also, Kurt Vonnegut's also another one who I'm just like, he's not entirely sci-fi, but like his sci-fi work is just some of my favorites, like, writing. And that's the thing. It's reimagining the future, and also at the same time just saying a lot about humanity at the time. And I think by talking about humanity at the time, but putting it in worlds that you don't necessarily relate to, like you said, it allows to make a more universal story almost. It allows it to be this thing that you can relate to 50 years later.
Absolutely. And, I was going to say, because you had just mentioned critiques on religion. When I was, I think, about 12, I read The Handmaid's Tale.
Ooh.
And it completely revolutionized how I saw or understood the terms of patriarchy and just the woman's role in society. And I credit that book with, I think, starting me on my journey of just having my eyes open. I mean, when you're 12, you don't really know that, you're living in a patriarchal world per se, or you don't have the language for it. But that book and just the way that women were treated made me think so much more of what was happening around me and how I saw things happening. And I mean, by then I'd have gone to a lot of weddings where they take away the bride and all, like, the young girls, and they put them in a room and they tell you things like, sometimes a man's going to come home and he's going to be really mad. You mustn't contribute to that madness. Try and be as, as unirritating as possible. Also, sometimes men stray, and this will happen a few times, and you just got to, begezela is the word that they use in Zulu, but basically it just means like just hang in there, like, don't make a fuss, like, this happens, this is what men are. And I remember being young and thinking, this sounds like bullshit, but everyone else around me, like, nodding. So I was like, oh, okay. When I read that book, I was like, for sure, this is bullshit. and I've never looked back. So sci-fi really helped in that sense.
So like literature in general has been a big part of your awakening?
It has, completely. Even my transition to not being religious, that was happened about 10, 11. And I already was kind of, this sounds bogus to me, especially when my teacher was telling us about how dinosaurs weren't featured in the Bible. And then she also made the mistake of saying that Jesus was white. And I was like, really? And shame, to be fair, I don't think she was doing it maliciously. I just think that she herself had never thought of it anything other than that being the possibility. And I remember coming home to my mom and saying, I don't think this is for me, and I'd like to move schools. There's nothing wrong with the school, but I'm just not going to be able to be taught in this way. And to her credit, my mom was like, okay. And she got me a new school the next year that was non-denominational. And I've never looked back. I was just like, I don't believe this stuff. And then obviously as you grow up and you understand colonialism and how religion came to our shores, I just became more and more like, this is not it. And in fact, I went through a very anti-religious
I think most people who like turn away from religion do get into that phase, because I definitely had a very strong anti-religion phase for a while. Nowadays I'm just like, you do you, like just don't interfere with anyone else. But yeah, what was your anti-religion phase like? Please don't tell me it was based because of Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris.
No. Although I did read them much later. No, my anti-religious phase was sort of in my teens, where I was just, you sort of like in this discovery phase where you're starting to read more and you're starting to pay more attention to the rest of the world, and you're seeing like, what, women aren't allowed to drive, and this religion says this must happen, and he's like, what the fuck is going on here? And so I became very militant about how all religion is bad, and that essentially all you had to do was just be a good person on this earth, and that should be enough of a ticket if there is an afterlife to get you into it, and if there isn't, then anyway. And I mean, I was never like sort of intolerant about people's views. I understood that, we're all sort of made from our circumstances and our family circumstances, but I was very just angry about it. And now I'm sort of like you, like I just said, people must do what they want and just not interfere with others. Although it's really difficult, because on the one hand, when I think of some forms of traditional African rights, I speak strongly out against them, but I'm very careful to make sure that even within that, I still allow people to have the choice to doing it. So something like virginity testing, which still happens in KZN, to me is an abhorrent practice. It's absolutely awful. But I also understand there's a huge amount of people in KZN, particularly in the rural areas, where it's still seen as something that's quite an honor and something that people look forward to, and saying, to their families, look, I am a virgin and I've really, kept myself well. I've been a pure person, etc., etc. And whatever I might think about what that means and what that actually says about their own value as women, is not for me to also impose on people in the way that their lives are structured. And so sometimes it's very difficult in politics to take away your own personal views, and also be, I think, tolerant of how some people still believe in things. But it's okay, and I think it's a learning curve, and I think it's part of the interesting things about South Africa. Where I do draw the line is where it becomes things that actually are violent towards people. Yeah. So, for example, things like female genital mutilation, I'm not respectful of that practice at all.
I would hope not. I would hope not.
Yeah.
I can't imagine
despite
too many.
Whichever reasons people have, I just think that there's absolutely no way that we can justify doing that to young girls. So I do have a line of the tolerance that I have towards even traditional ceremonies and rites and stuff.
It is a tricky thing. I think, I can't remember, Tani Mungwe said something. It's like about negotiating shared values. It's essentially what we're still doing as a society, like we're still going like, is this okay? Is this not okay? Why would this be okay? And at the same time, you've also got to let people decide for themselves, what is okay. A lot of the time, you got to protect people where you can as much as you can. But at the same time, it can be like imposing Western ideals on, non-Western societies, that's a recipe for disaster in a lot of cases. But at the same time, as a global society, we are also constantly negotiating how to move forward. And yeah, it has definitely created a very unique space, especially in South Africa.
I really love that thing, like you said, about negotiating shared values. I'm going to use that because that actually is
Tani Mongwe. Make sure you give her the credit there.
Okay, I'll get the name. But I really love it. And I mean, I sit on the COCTA committee in KZN, and it deals with obviously local government, but it also deals a lot with traditional leadership. And I cannot tell you how important that particular quote is, the negotiating of shared values is, because on the one hand, you have people who live particularly in rural areas, although it's not just rural areas, there's some peri-urban areas that also have izindunas and amakhosi, where there is a clash between the Western Roman Dutch law that we have and the traditional sort of ancestral law that we've always had. And especially now when it comes to things like, well, who really is the representative of the community? Is it the Nduna, who has been chosen by the Nkosi or has it by hereditary rights for whatever reasons, and actually believes that these are his people, and so sometimes really does take care of them better than the elected councillor? Or in some instances, the councillor might be useless, but the Nduna is also just as exploitative, but people can't break away from the system of having them, because then you collapse an entire way of life. Then you have to start talking about land ownership, and then you start talking about people being scared to go into the Roman Dutch law version because they're worried that one day that land might be taken from them. And they would rather actually have this system where at least they're guaranteed to have the land of their forefathers, where their families are buried, where they are able to do their ancestral ceremonies in perpetuity rather than move from it. But what that also means then is that they have productive land that they could be using in many other ways, if you think of a Western aspect. But many times in the traditional aspects, the productive land means nothing if your soul is not part of your own place that you call home. And it's such a difficult thing to do and to try and negotiate, because you understand both sides of the equation. And we're still not anywhere close to sorting out how we can give value to the land, but at the same time not take away what is essentially people's spiritual and physical homes, for lack of a better word.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thanks for enlightening us on that. I'm actually going to go to Patreon questions now. We've got three from one person. The first two are pretty much related to sci-fi, and the last one, which I think will be the last question, is a political one. So the first question, it's all about Vishendra Naidu. Thank you very much, Vishendra, for A, being a patron, and B, for submitting questions. I really appreciate it. He wants to know, what are your thoughts on the new Star Wars trilogy and whether it deserved the hate it received?
So I like the first one a lot. I was so excited because I really hated the Anakin Skywalker trilogy.
Yeah.
I really hated that. I really thought that it took away so much from the original. So when Force Awakens came on, I was like, oh yes, we're getting back to the kind of Star Wars feeling that we used to get from the original saga. I hated the second one though.
Really?
I thought it was such a waste. And I
love the second one. It's like my favorite Star Wars movie. Like out of all the Star Wars, I love it so much. Why do you dislike it?
No, I mean the second one of this last trilogy, not Return of the Jedi. I mean, what was the second one called again?
The Last Jedi. That's the one I'm talking about. That's the one for me. Like I absolutely loved it. I left the cinema and I was just like, that is my Star Wars. Like this is everything I want. Like, but what did you dislike about it?
I just felt like everybody was wasted, and I thought that everything that they had started in the beginning in Force Awakens kind of just went all over the place in the second one. I mean, the action was still good. There was still a few good moments, but I didn't get the points of it really. And then when the third one came in, I just felt like it had been even more voiced, because all of those journeys and personal growth that had happened in them seemed to kind of be erased as far as I was concerned.
I'll agree with you there. The third one is just, it needs to just be removed entirely. Like I hated
Yeah,
it.
I didn't understand why they had to cop it out like that. It had so much going for it. But yeah, I don't know. So anyway, that's what I felt. But overall, I mean, I was just happy that there were more Star Wars films being made. So as a Star Wars fan, I will take even the crappy ones. I will watch them. I'll be there on the first day. So I was just happy, and one for my generation. I really, 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 really loved John Boyega from those films, and then I loved him even more just following him as a person on Instagram and everything. I have a major crush on him now.
Yeah, I loved him in Attack the Block, and then seeing him since then, like obviously in Star Wars, and then seeing him online just own people. Like it's just like I love it. He's like a no nonsense kind of guy, and I really, really appreciate that. And also just a phenomenal actor.
Yeah, I really enjoyed watching him. And then I'm a big fan of Adam Driver as well. So, I mean, I loved him sort of in the first two seasons, which are really the only ones I watched of Girls. And every time I see him in any role, he just owns it and he's so good. And so
yeah, he's a very good actor.
Yeah, I really loved his portrayal of Kylo Ren. And I think if he hadn't been in it, it would have been much, much worse. I'm just sad that Luke died.
But yeah, I mean, he had to. Everyone dies. Like that is the one thing I think we all know.
I actually watched the second one. Was it the second one? I think it was the first one. I actually watched it in Guatemala the day that Carrie Fisher died, and it was just that much more emotional. Everyone in the cinema was really sad because the news had just come out on the internet, and we had been watching it, and I was sort of like in this movie theater with people who were crying, and I was watching it in Spanish at the time because I didn't realize that they would also have an English version. It was really amazing. So yeah, I would take the Star Wars trilogy again, in short, but I could have done without some element of it. I mean, that's what was her name? Rosie. Was that her name?
Yeah.
What happened to that character?
What happened to that character was white people online complained. Like that's genuinely what happened. That's like people complained about the diversity and about them pushing for feminism and all of that. And so in the third movie, they decided to cut back on it.
It's literally a movie in space with aliens. Come on.
I know.
Anyway, okay, what's the next question?
Okay, the next question is, what are your recommendations for must-read novels in the sci-fi genre, especially any newer releases?
Oh, no, that's a hard question. Oh. Okay, well, firstly, I'm obviously always going to punt Isaac Asimov books. And even though they're not newer releases, they may as well be. That's how incredible they are. Philip K. Dick, also somebody I really love. And according to Bob, Dune, definitely someone threw it in there. What latest ones have I read? I mean, I went through a lot of like sort of the trilogies that came out when I was a youth, like Philip Pullman and those kinds of, but those are for a bit younger readers. So, I mean, I don't know. They're very accessible to read and they're also just as interesting and as fascinating. But I don't know if it's more
poppy.
Yeah, it's a bit more for young adults. Is that the term that they use now? For teen books? Yeah. What else do I really love at the moment?
Did you ever get into Ursula K?
Sorry?
Ursula K. Guin?
I haven't.
Ooh, I think you should add her to your reading list. She's phenomenal. She's actually got, like, one of the books I've got here is a double, like, it's a little paperback of her and Asimov. Like, the one half is an Asimov book and the other half is Ursula K. Guin.
Wow, okay. I will look into that. And then I would also say, he's not really sci-fi, but he's got, like, an interesting way of writing. Neil Gaiman, I've been reading him as well.
Yeah, he's a bit more fantasy, but, like, Sandman.
Yeah, he's not so much sci-fi per se. But you know what? I must actually just go write these down because I feel like I'm hitting a blank now that I have to think about what I really recommend. And then maybe I can just send them to you and you can put them up somewhere, Bob.
Yeah, I'll put them in the show notes on the website. But yeah, I also, I mean, American Gods is amazing. Sandman's amazing. Everything by Neil Gaiman, I also highly recommend.
Mhm.
Cool. And then the last question is a very good question. Let me open this up here. Is on a heavier note, he wants your insights into the divisive nature of politics and how it has ramped up the past few years, especially the us versus them mentality seems much more prominent these days. What steps can be taken to bring people together over time?
Oh,
Yeah.
well, that's true. And I think that what people have always known, but it's sort of, done a cycle around the world and has come back again now, is that division in politics is the easiest way to actually get votes. It's very, very difficult to try and get people to coalesce around an idea that is sort of metaphorical, like hope or like unity or like just going forward together. It's very difficult, especially when people have so many diverse needs and so many conflicting needs of what needs to be done first. So if you're able to tap into an issue or a grouping of people that have particular concerns and escalate those concerns above all others, you are able to create a very strong natural base for yourself. And I think we've seen that with Trump in America. We're seeing it in the UK with the Brexiteers movement. We
saw it about 70 or 80 years ago in Germany.
Yeah. We saw it in Germany. And we see it in this country. Well, we've also lived it in this country for a really long time. But I think we're also starting to see it more. And I think it happens particularly when people are also running out of ideas on how to fix the immediate problems. That they kind of just give up and say, well, you know what, we're not going to fix everything, but at least we can stay in power by just making sure that we do the bare minimum for the blacks or the coloreds or the whites. And it's easy because we haven't really reached across the divide to each other enough to always see each other as human beings. I think it's a lot better in South Africa, but I think there's still such a lack of real integration that it's easy for smart politicians to divide us. And it's not even really hard to look. I mean, in the Durban scene, we have things like, this is a black club, this is a white club, this is an Indian club, this is a colored club. Yep. And you'll get a few exceptions that will, of people that will go to them that aren't the majority. But we don't have socially integrated spaces in Durban, as far as I'm aware, that people that people can be there on an equal footing. And probably the most are like malls, but even there, everyone's just getting along and doing their own business. And I think
it's also based on finances and like that's negating the rural population essentially. So
yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, and for me, and this is one of the things that I've also just found as a mother, is trying to have places where you can have play dates or public spaces for that kind of thing is impossible when it isn't sort of a one race group. So because I'm in Durban North, there'll only be majority really white people in those spaces, even at the baby classes and all that kind of stuff. There aren't many spaces where there's integration that happens naturally in our country. And I think until we have that, we're going to be easy to divide. And things like music could be bringing us together, but I don't know, we still, even there, seem to be quite disintegrated in how we have those spaces happening.
Yeah, I think in the mainstream, definitely. But one of the things that I love about the music scene has been that it's on the underground level, on the, it's been the one thing that I think for myself, I've interacted with black culture a lot more through music, through South African music. It's been the olive branch essentially for me to go into spaces that I might not necessarily have gone into beforehand. But because I know the music, because I love the musician, I'll go to a space where I'm the only white guy because I also know nowadays that that's totally fine. Like, you're like, I did have fears when I was younger, definitely. But every space these days, it's the same. It's just we do have these fears and we do have these insecurities. And also stuff isn't necessarily marketed across, the racial lines and stuff. And that's why I do love music events where, and not just music events, art events, where it is a diverse lineup, where you do have, musicians with a variety of sounds compared to, just your rock gigs or just your rap gigs and stuff like that.
Well, you are doing the Lord's work because people come to us. And I mean, I've been to a few of the shows that you have been the host of, and it has been very diverse crowds. And if we could have that more, I really think that you start to break down the barriers that we have in society. And so that when people start trying to divide us, there's a whole host of voices of different people saying we won't accept that. But it's hard. It's hard because it's part of nation building. And whilst you're doing that in terms of sort of social cultural thing, you actually have to produce some results of the country working, basic things, the post office, the police station, so that people can actually believe, okay, things are happening here. And then it just kind of spirals into more hope and more integration and more seeing each other as human beings. But I just think that we don't have the political will in our leaders at the moment. I see no leader in this country that I feel particularly excited about, or that I think they're going to make any kind of difference, particularly for my generation who is now kind of in the middle in South Africa. You know, people think millennials are young. We are in our 30s. And we've really...
I think a lot of people still see that as young.
Well, I mean, we're not like in our 20s. We're kind of in we're kind of in the transition phase of, you know, young, but also like doing real adulting. And so many people are left out of that because there's just no opportunities for them. And then you just stunt people's ability to move in their lives. And I think for me, that's the most urgent crisis that we have, is that we really need to sort out our economy. We really need to be putting out ethical ways of how we can turn around the system, advocate for a stakeholder economy where everyone gets a slice of the pie, advocate for government and private partnerships where government can't do things like securing toilets at schools, that we are incentivizing business to take part of those on for tax breaks or for however we decide to structure it, because this idea of thinking that they're going to work in two silos is killing us all.
I get you there. And I guess that's why you're with the DA, because that is like a DA philosophy essentially, is that if public can't do it, then private must. Or
I don't believe in rampant privatization either, because I don't trust that business always has the best interest for people. But certainly what you can do as the government is have agreements where you can say, for example, that like what we have with Telkom, you sort of lease it to the best regulator who can make it work, but you definitely cap the numbers that it can have it so that this doesn't become a monopoly, and you have ways that you can constantly review the relationship. And if it isn't working or if it is being exploitative, then you have an out as the government, because as the government, your main role should be looking out for citizens. So whilst I think that we should definitely be getting private companies to help with our water boards and to actually get water that we have sitting in dams around to all of KZN, I would never agree for water to be privatized, because then we're just going into disaster. But certainly our government just doesn't have the capacity nor the professionalization of enough officials to do the enormous amounts of work that is needed from them. And there's so many young entrepreneurs sitting there with excellent ideas who could be helping with all of these issues, that we should be giving them a chance. And so also when I speak about the private sector, I'm not speaking about big captains of industry and conglomerates. I'm talking about the ordinary SMME guy who could do some of this stuff, provide for his family, and, you know, employ another 50 people. And that's what we need to be really looking at. But the government must always make sure, unlike the arms deals, that there are real deliverables and has a real ability to terminate the contract if needs be. But I mean, again, all of this also requires that people are actually ethical, because we've seen that most of our officials are not ethical, and they become part and parcel of the problem. So it becomes the politicians, officials, and then some private sector people. But I still think that it can be done. But I think you just need stronger people in charge.
And do you see the youth vote or millennials, younger people, being the key to that?
Well, 12 million of them stayed away from the last election. And I didn't think it was because of apathy. I think it's just because they don't trust any of the political parties.
Yeah, I would say that's 100%.
Yeah. And I think until somebody is actually going to speak to them and hear what they have to say and not just tell them what they should be thinking, then there isn't going to be a major shift in terms of their voting. And that's really sad, because 12 million votes could change the trajectory of this country. But I'm certainly going to try, if I am successful in my leadership race, to be the kind of person that is going to be open enough and accessible enough to them to be able to come through, tell me, help also them, because I certainly don't have all the answers myself. And hopefully we can make it a joint project of just young people taking over.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you there. And yeah, I wish you luck for the leadership. I assume the debates aren't happening, judging by the lack of response.
Yes, there has yet to be a response.
Awkward. Well, for me personally, it's impossible to get a response from John because he has blocked me on Twitter. So I'm, thankful for your time today. Because, this is the exact opposite of that. And I really appreciate, you just being so open and honest and wanting to actually make a difference, because I do believe you. And that's very, very rare. And one of the things I even saw Chester missing, like, shout you out. And, I also don't think Conrad necessarily believes much in politicians. So I think you've got a lot of people interested, and it would be a shame if the DA had to, just not look at the future properly.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, cool. I'll see you on the Twitter streets, and I hope you have the good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Cool. Cheers.
Bye.